A cold wind sweeps over the Pacific. A submarine drifts in the moonlit darkness, its periscope breaking the surface like a single silver eye. The captain whispers a bearing to the helmsman. The target, a Japanese freighter, cuts through the night unaware. The crew holds their breath. Fire 1. A jolt. A rush of compressed air. A trail of bubble streaks toward the target, straight, true, deadly. But then silence. The men wait for the thunder that should follow. Seconds become half a minute. Then a minute. Nothing. The torpedo had hit. But it hadn't exploded. Another dud. Somewhere in that steel coffin, an officer slams his fist against the periscope column. Another whispers bitterly, "We might as well be throwing rocks." The contradiction of power. It was 1942, the first desperate year of the Pacific War. The United States Navy, armed with the mightiest fleet on Earth, had sailed into battle with torpedoes that could not kill. The Mark 14, America's standard submarine torpedo, was a marvel of engineering on paper. 20 feet long, 3,000 pounds of high explosive, driven by a steam turbine guided by gyroscopes, and equipped with a magnetic detonator so advanced it was said to explode beneath a ship, snapping its keel in two. But in the real world, in the dark oceans from Java to the Coral Sea, those torpedoes missed. They ran too deep. Their detonators failed. Their magnetic triggers exploded prematurely or not at all. Commanders filed reports. Dozens, then hundreds. Hits, no explosions. Premature detonations. Possible depth errors. The Bureau of Ordnance, the powerful, secretive institution responsible for American naval weapons, dismissed them all. The data they insisted was wrong. The submariners must be at fault. The torpedoes were fine. For the men at sea, this denial was more than a technical issue. It was betrayal. They were risking their lives, fighting an enemy that did not forgive mistakes, armed with weapons that would not work. And yet, at the very heart of this bureaucratic blindness, one man refused to accept the official truth. Enter the Mad Admiral. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, was a quiet, thoughtful officer known for his fairness and for the calm way he lit his pipe even under pressure. But as reports from his submarines mounted, his patience thinned. He was not yet called mad. Not yet. But in the summer of 1942, as American subs limped back from missions empty-handed, Lockwood began to suspect something unthinkable, that the Navy's own bureau had sent men into war with defective weapons. When he voiced that suspicion, Washington responded with icy silence. Admirals in Washington said the problem was crew error. They said Lockwood's captains were inexperienced. They said testing torpedoes was too expensive. Lockwood didn't buy it. He ordered his own tests, an act of quiet rebellion. On June 20, 1942, in the waters off Australia, Lockwood gathered his staff and several submarine officers aboard a small test range. They fired live torpedoes at cliffs, at nets, at anchored hulks. They measured depth tracks. They recorded impacts. And they watched, with growing fury, as torpedo after torpedo struck its target and failed to explode. Then came the revelation. The torpedoes were running nearly 10 feet deeper than their settings. Lockwood's suspicions hardened into certainty. America's submarines had been fighting with weapons that literally ran underneath their targets. And that was only the beginning. The tragic irony of progress. In the years before the war, the Bureau of Ordnance had guarded its technology like a crown jewel. The Mark 14 torpedo and its magnetic exploder, the Mark 6, had been developed in secrecy at the Newport Torpedo Station. Few outside the Bureau even knew how they worked. They were so advanced that even their own submariners were not permitted to test them with live warheads. The result was a perfect illusion. On paper, the Mark 14 was flawless. In practice, it was a masterpiece of theoretical engineering that reality refused to obey. The irony was devastating. The very institution meant to arm the Navy had become a prison of its own arrogance. Obsessed with innovation, allergic to evidence. By 1943, some submarine commanders were so frustrated that they fired dozens of torpedoes at single ships to score one sinking. Some returned home broken, convinced they had failed. Others simply stopped reporting hits that didn't explode. It hurt too much to write. For them, every click of a dud was a death sentence for a crewman somewhere else who might not live long enough to see the truth exposed. The war turns, the doubt deepens. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific was bleeding. The Japanese Empire had stretched from Burma to the Solomons. Every submarine patrol mattered. Every lost shot was a lost chance to choke Japan's lifelines. Lockwood's madness grew. He began to speak openly against the Bureau. He called for head-on tests with live torpedoes against real targets. something long forbidden. He was warned by Washington to stand down. He did not. Instead, he ordered the tests himself. In a series of secret firings near the Hawaiian coast, Lockwood's crews proved what no one in Washington wanted to believe. The Mark 14's contact detonator also failed at sharp impact angles. The firing pin was too weak to trigger the explosion. The news hit like a depth charge through the Navy's ranks. Now there were not one but 3 fatal flaws. The torpedo ran too deep. The magnetic exploder detonated prematurely. The contact detonator often failed completely. It was a triad of failure wrapped in secrecy and pride. The impossible inquiry. When Lockwood sent his findings to Washington, he was met with outrage. Bureau officials called his methods unscientific. They said his conclusions were reckless. Some even questioned his loyalty. He was now officially the Mad Admiral. But his madness was methodical. Lockwood ordered a complete field investigation, an impossible inquiry, as one aide called it, because it meant confronting a decade of institutional denial. He gathered data from every submarine in the Pacific. He demanded that every dud be recovered, disassembled, and examined. He sent coded memos demanding proof, not excuses. For the first time, the silent war under the sea was being waged not only against the enemy, but against the Navy's own blindness. It was a battle of truth against authority, of reality against theory, of one man's conscience against a machine built to resist change. The moment of vindication. In August 1943, after months of confrontation and testing, Lockwood's inquiry forced the Bureau to admit what it could no longer deny. Orders went out across the Pacific. Disable the magnetic exploder. Adjust torpedo depth to correct the 10-foot error. Reinforce the contact detonator. The results were immediate and devastating for Japan. Submarines that had once returned empty now came back with victory pennants fluttering. Sinkings tripled. By 1944, American submarines had strangled Japan's maritime supply lines, sinking more than 1,000 enemy ships, the lifeblood of an empire. Lockwood's madness had saved the U.S. submarine force, and turned the Pacific War. The hidden war behind the war. In the official records, the story was buried in test memos and damage reports. But among the men who fought in the silent service, it became legend, the tale of the admiral who refused to believe what the system told him. Because beneath the statistics lay something deeper. The Navy's greatest enemy in those years wasn't Japan. It was complacency. It was the quiet, bureaucratic arrogance that mistook paperwork for truth. The Mark 14 story was not just a failure of machinery, it was a failure of faith and evidence. It revealed that the modern war machine, for all its science and steel, still ran on human courage. The courage to question, to disobey, to face ridicule in pursuit of truth. The weapon was never the torpedo. In the end, the Mark 14 was repaired, but it was never the torpedo itself that won the war. It was the human mind behind it. The stubborn integrity of a man who refused to accept easy answers. Lockwood's fight was not only about engineering. It was about moral physics, the law that says truth once tested cannot remain buried forever. Because in war, as in life, the real weapon is not made of metal or powder, but of conviction. Sound fades in, the low thrum of engines deep beneath the sea, a rhythmic heartbeat of machinery and men. When America entered the Pacific War after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. submarine force was small but deadly in theory. 55 submarines scattered across the Pacific were to be the Navy's spear, unseen, unstoppable, armed with the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon promised to deliver precision destruction. Each torpedo cost the Navy $10,000, roughly the price of a house in 1941. Each carried 643 pounds of TNT. Each was the culmination of decades of engineering secrecy. But as early patrols went out in December 1941 and January 1942, reports began returning that chilled the optimism of the silent service. The USS Seawolf fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese transport, all missed. The USS Sargo recorded 4 direct hits, not one explosion. The USS Tautog scored what the captain swore were perfect shots. Again, silence. At first, the Navy blamed the seas. Then the crews. Then bad luck. In Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance, the so-called board, reassured Congress and the Navy's top brass. The torpedo works as designed. Fault lies with the operators. But at sea, the operators knew better. They lived inside those metal tubes. They knew the sound of a miss, the heartbreak of a dud. They were haunted by the metallic clink that should have been a roar. One commander wrote in his patrol log, "We hit her square on the beam. Saw the wake cross amidships. Should have split her in half. Instead, a dull thud. I could have sworn I saw men on deck laughing at us. The bureaucratic fortress. To understand why no one believed the submariners, you must understand the world they were fighting against. Not Japan but the Bureau itself. The Bureau of Ordnance was the most powerful weapons authority in the U.S. Navy. Based in Washington, D.C. and Newport, Rhode Island, it had designed the Mark 14 and its magnetic exploder in near-total secrecy throughout the 1930s. The Mark 6 exploder, the heart of the system, had been considered so advanced it was kept under lock and key. Even most submarine captains were not allowed to know its mechanism. The Bureau's doctrine was simple: theory over practice. Testing was expensive and live-fire trials were rare. In 10 years of development, only 2 torpedoes had ever been fired with live warheads against real targets. In war, that number would prove catastrophic. When reports began pouring in from the Pacific that torpedoes failed to detonate, boards simply couldn't accept it. They sent back memoranda insisting the evidence was anecdotal. They reminded commanders that impact angles, or improper arming, were likely at fault. They ordered no live tests, no field adjustments, no public inquiry. And thus, for nearly 18 months, the United States Navy fought with weapons that would not work, while its enemies, the Imperial Japanese Navy, fought with torpedoes that were decades ahead in reliability and range. The irony was complete. The richest navy on Earth had the poorest weapon beneath the waves. Lockwood's Rebellion. In early 1942, Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood took command of Submarine Force, Southwest Pacific. At first, he trusted the Bureau's assurances. But by mid-year, after dozens of failed patrols, he began to suspect something darker. Lockwood was not a revolutionary by nature. He was methodical, almost scholarly, a man who carried an air of calm authority and kindness. His crew called him Uncle Charlie. But behind the pipe smoke and polite demeanor was steel. When a commander returned from a patrol reporting 7 hits and no explosions, Lockwood summoned him to headquarters. "Are you sure of your firing solutions?" he asked. "Positive, sir." "Then it's not you," Lockwood muttered. "It's the damn torpedo." He began collecting evidence: every dud, every premature detonation, every misfire. By June 1942 he had enough. He gathered his officers near the cliffs of Fremantle, Australia, and ordered a series of controlled firings at a stationary target hulk. They set the torpedoes to run at 10 feet. They ran at 20. Lockwood's engineers double-checked. The evidence was irrefutable. The depth control mechanism was off by almost 10 feet. For months, submarines had been firing under their targets. Lockwood's findings directly contradicted everything the Bureau had declared infallible. He wired Washington. "Tests indicate torpedoes running 10 feet deeper than set. Request immediate action." The reply was curt. "Bureau confident in equipment. Recommend checking submarine depth gauges." It was classic Washington deflection. Blame the men, not the machine. Lockwood seethed. One of his staff officers later wrote, "That was the day Uncle Charlie stopped being patient." He ordered another series of tests. This time, they suspended torpedoes by cables under floating platforms and measured buoyancy and depth manually. The results were the same. By September 1942, Lockwood was convinced that his men had been lied to, not by malice but by arrogance. The Bureau had designed its torpedo with a flawed testing assumption, that the torpedo's buoyancy would remain stable under pressure. It hadn't. The instrument that measured running depth, a bellows-type hydrostatic device, had been calibrated in freshwater, not seawater. The result: every torpedo ran deeper in the denser salt water of the Pacific. It was an invisible, scientific error, one that had cost hundreds of lives and months of lost opportunity. The confrontation, the impossible inquiry. When Lockwood was transferred to Pearl Harbor as Commander, Submarine Force, Pacific Fleet, he took his rebellion with him. Now in charge of the entire U.S. submarine campaign, he had both authority and a target: the Bureau of Ordnance. He launched what his staff jokingly called Lockwood's Inquisition. Every torpedo malfunction was documented. Every crew report was logged. He assigned officers to dismantle dud torpedoes and examine firing pins, detonators, and magnetic exploders. In April 1943, Lockwood wrote a classified memorandum titled Investigation of Torpedo Reliability. It ran 27 pages, a scathing indictment of the Bureau's failures. At the same time, another admiral, Ralph Waldo Christie, head of the Australian Submarine Command, was also conducting his own tests. But Christie was a Bureau loyalist. He believed in the magnetic exploder. He refused to disable it. The two men clashed bitterly. Lockwood argued for evidence and simplicity. Christie insisted on faith in technology. The rivalry became a quiet civil war within the Navy itself. In May 1943, Lockwood took the final step, a live-fire test against the hulk of the USS Sturgeon. They fired torpedoes at varying angles. At direct 90-degree impact, most detonated. At glancing angles, nothing. The contact exploder's firing pin was too weak. The force of oblique impact bent it, preventing detonation. Lockwood's staff redesigned the pin on the spot, adding a stronger spring and improved alignment. When tested, the redesigned detonator worked flawlessly. That same month, Lockwood sent his decisive message to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. If Bureau of Ordnance cannot provide U.S. with torpedoes that work, then get the Bureau of Ships to build something that will. It was a declaration of war, not against Japan but against incompetence. The human element, the men who fought blind. For the submariners, Lockwood's inquiry was more than a technical crusade. It was salvation. Letters from crewmen began reaching his desk. "Sir, we fired 11 fish at one freighter. All hits. All duds. If I'd had a gun, I'd have shot the Bureau myself." Others expressed guilt. Men who believed for months that they had failed their country, when in truth their country had failed them. One captain, Commander Dudley Mush Morton of the USS Wahoo, wrote in his log, "These torpedoes are the worst piece of junk ever put to sea. If we lose this war, I'll know who to blame." Another, Lieutenant Commander Dick O'Kane, later recalled, "We had the enemy in our sights, close enough to smell their exhaust. But when the fish wouldn't detonate, it felt like being stripped naked in front of your enemy." Lockwood read those lines and kept them on his desk. They reminded him why his fight mattered. He knew that for every dead torpedo, a patrol might end with 20 men never returning, sunk by destroyers they couldn't kill. And so he pushed harder. By mid-1943, his engineers had confirmed all 3 defects. Lockwood risked his career by bypassing Bureau authorization and issuing direct orders to his submarine captains. Disable magnetic exploders. Adjust for 10-foot depth error. Replace contact pins. It was open defiance. It was also the turning point. Consequences: the day the torpedoes worked. By late summer of 1943, the transformation was undeniable. Submarines that had struggled to sink a single ship now returned with records that defied belief. The USS Bofin sank 13 ships in 2 patrols. The USS Wahoo wiped out an entire Japanese convoy in the Sea of Japan. The USS Tang, commanded by O'Kane, sank 24 ships in 5 patrols, more than any other U.S. submarine in history. The kill rate tripled. Japan's merchant fleet, once 6 million tons strong, shrank by half within a year. By 1944, American submarines, just 2% of the U.S. Navy, were sinking more than 55% of all Japanese ships lost at sea. Lockwood's madness had become the foundation of victory. The Bureau of Ordnance, chastened and humiliated, quietly adopted every one of his recommendations. They did not apologize. They did not admit fault. But they changed. And that, Lockwood later wrote, was enough. Reflection, truth beneath the waves. By war's end, the numbers told a brutal story. 1,314 Japanese merchant ships sunk, .201 warships destroyed. Nearly 5 million tons of cargo sent to the bottom of the sea. All because one man refused to be silenced. Yet for Lockwood, victory was bittersweet. He often said the hardest part of command was writing letters to families, explaining why a submarine never returned. He knew that many of those deaths had been preventable. He knew that months, perhaps a year, had been lost to bureaucratic arrogance. In a 1945 letter, he wrote to a fellow admiral, "The tragedy of our torpedo story is not in the machines that failed, but in the minds that refused to see. We fought 2 enemies, one in Tokyo, one in Washington. The second was harder to defeat." Lockwood's impossible inquiry became a case study in leadership, not the glamorous kind but the moral kind, the courage to confront one's own institution. Historians would later call him the patron saint of accountability. But to the men who served under him, he was simply the admiral who gave us back our faith. CT-7, the legacy beneath the surface. When peace came in 1945, the Mark 14 story was quietly buried. The Navy never issued a public apology. The Bureau of Ordnance was reorganized, renamed, restructured, but never held formally accountable. Lockwood retired in 1947, a 4-star admiral, respected but not celebrated. In interviews he downplayed his role. "All I did," he said, "was insist that our torpedoes should explode when they hit things." But the truth was larger. His rebellion had proven something that went beyond war. that even in the most disciplined hierarchies, truth must sometimes come from defiance. The Mark 14 had failed not because men were careless, but because systems preferred comfort to correction. And Lockwood's inquiry, born of frustration and loyalty in equal measure, became a lesson for every generation of soldier, scientist, and citizen that followed. Technology is only as strong as the honesty of those who test it. Sound fades, the echo of sonar pings in dark water, the hush of waves over a quiet sea. The camera lingers on a rusted torpedo casing resting on the seafloor, barnacled and silent. Voiceover softens. In the end, the war beneath the waves was not only against the enemy but against illusion. And for a time, truth itself had to fight to survive. A slow, hollow wind over the Pacific Ocean. The war is over now. The submarines that once stalked the seas rest quietly in harbors or rust beneath the waves. Their crews have grown old, their laughter and curses fading into the tide. But somewhere beneath the ocean's skin, among the ghosts of steel and salt, the echoes of one man's defiance still drift, proof that truth, once spoken, never truly sinks. Epilogue: The Sea After Victory. It is 1945. The Empire of Japan has surrendered. The Pacific, once a graveyard of ships, lies still. Admiral Charles Lockwood walks along the docks of Pearl Harbor, past rows of submarines returning from their final patrols. He stops beside the USS Tang, the USS Barb, the USS Wahoo, names that have already become legend. He looks out across the harbor where, for years earlier, smoke and flame had first ignited America's fury. Now the air is peaceful. But his eyes are not. He knows what this victory cost, not just in blood but in blindness. For every triumph at sea, there had been months of confusion, silence, and loss. Men lost not to enemy skill, but to their own nation's refusal to listen. Lockwood lights his pipe. The match flares then fades. God help the next war, he murmurs, if we ever forget how close we came to losing this one, not to the enemy but to ourselves. The hidden cost of progress. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo is not simply about a malfunctioning weapon. It is about the peril of perfection, the way institutions, in their pursuit of innovation, can become prisoners of their own pride. For a decade before the war, America's engineers believed they had built a flawless machine. It was designed by the best minds at the Newport Torpedo Station. Men who measured every bolt and valve, every magnetic pulse. But in that perfection lay fragility. They trusted theory over testing. Numbers over reality. When the first doubts arose in 1942, the Bureau of Ordnance did not ask, "What if we are wrong?" They asked, "Who dares question us?" That single difference, between curiosity and pride, nearly cost America the war beneath the sea. Lockwood's impossible inquiry was more than a technical investigation, was a moral one. He had to ask the unaskable. Could the very weapon meant to protect a nation be its own undoing? And in asking, he violated the first rule of every great institution: never embarrass the system. But history rarely rewards silence. It rewards those who risk the wrath of their peers to serve the truth. When the Bureau of Ordnance finally admitted fault in late 1943, it did so quietly, through revised memos and technical orders. There were no apologies. No headlines. The men who had dismissed Lockwood's warnings remained in their posts. Some were even promoted. In Washington, decorum was preserved. In the Pacific, lives were not. Yet Lockwood never sought revenge. He never demanded punishment. To his officers he said only this: "If you want to win a war, you must fight your enemy. But if you want to learn from one, you must face your own mistakes." He understood something timeless, that victory built on denial is no victory at all. And that in war, as in peace, the hardest truth to confront is the one that wears your own uniform. Human legacy, the men of the silent service. The submariners who served under Lockwood carried his lessons long after the war. They were a peculiar breed, equal parts engineer and warrior, men who lived in steel coffins beneath miles of water. They fought not for glory but for precision, for duty, for the satisfaction of doing something difficult perfectly. After the war, they formed the U.S. Submarine Veterans of World War II, a fraternity bound not by medals but by shared memory. In their reunions they spoke not of the ships they sank, but of the torpedoes that had failed, the comrades they had lost, and the quiet gratitude they felt toward the admiral who had believed them. At one 1950s reunion, an old commander stood to speak. He raised his glass and said, "To Admiral Lockwood, the only man in Washington who ever listened when we said something didn't work." The hall fell silent, then erupted in applause. For them, Lockwood was not just a leader. He was a symbol, proof that reason and conscience could coexist with command. The science of humility. In the decades that followed, the U.S. Navy transformed its entire approach to weapons testing. No system would ever again be accepted without exhaustive field trials. Every torpedo, missile, and sonar system would undergo live-fire verification. Those reforms, the quiet legacy of Lockwood's rebellion, saved untold lives in the Cold War that followed. But there was a subtler transformation too, a cultural one. The Mark 14 debacle had revealed something fundamental about science and power, that intelligence without humility becomes blindness. The engineers of the Bureau were brilliant men. They had equations, blueprints, patents. But they lacked curiosity, the willingness to ask whether their creation might fail. Lockwood, by contrast, was not an engineer. He was a commander who listened. He trusted observation over assumption, evidence over ego. And that made all the difference. Moral irony, the enemy's lesson. Here lies one of history's most painful ironies. The Japanese, whom Lockwood's submarines eventually strangled into submission, had understood this principle from the beginning. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedo was tested relentlessly, under live conditions in salt water at real combat ranges. It became the most lethal naval weapon of the early war. Its reliability was unmatched. In other words, Japan had done what America had refused to, test reality rather than theory. When the tables turned in 1944 and 1945, it was not only through firepower that the U.S. triumphed, but through humility forced by failure. The same arrogance that once shielded the Bureau was now stripped bare. The mad admiral, once mocked, had taught a superpower the value of doubt. A symbolic image, the dud torpedo. In the Smithsonian archives today rests a single Mark 14 torpedo, its casing cracked, its warhead inert. It was recovered from the seabed near the Solomons, one of the duds fired in 1942. It sits in silence, a relic of failure that changed the course of a war. Visitors rarely linger. They pass it by, drawn instead to the sleek aircraft and towering missiles nearby. But for those who stop to read the small plaque, a quiet truth emerges. This torpedo did not explode. Because of it, thousands of others later did. It is a paradox in steel, a weapon that achieved its purpose only through failure. Lockwood might have smiled at that. He understood that history's progress often begins in embarrassment. That the first step toward victory is the admission of error. The philosophical undercurrent. The war within. Every great war, when stripped of maps and medals, reveals two parallel conflicts, one external, one internal. The external war is fought with guns and ships. The internal one is fought with conscience. Lockwood's war was the second kind, the war of truth against hierarchy. In every generation, institutions face the same test. Will they silence those who question, or will they listen? The torpedo story, though buried in technical manuals, remains a warning for all modern societies that worship technology and data. We live, once again, in an age of perfect machines. Algorithms, drones, artificial intelligence, all promise to be flawless, all built by people as fallible as those who once calibrated the Mark 14 in freshwater. And so the question returns, more urgent than ever. Who among us will have the courage to say, it doesn't work? Who will be the next Lockwood, calm, stubborn, moral, in a world that punishes dissent and prizes efficiency over truth? Post-war reflections. Lockwood's final years. After the war, Admiral Lockwood retired quietly to California. He wrote books about submarine warfare, Sink 'em All in Hell at 50 Fathoms, but they were modest in tone, filled more with affection for his men than with bitterness toward the Bureau. When asked late in life what he was proudest of, he said, "Not the ships we sank, but the men who never stopped trying to make their weapons work, even when everything around them failed." He died in 1967, aged 75, buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery. At his funeral, a small group of former submariners placed a model torpedo beside his casket. On its side, a single word was engraved, "Working." The broader legacy, truth as a weapon. Lockwood's inquiry became a case study in military academies, engineering schools, and even corporate ethics seminars. It is cited not as a tale of victory, but as a parable of accountability. The lesson endures. Test what you build. Admit what you find. Listen to those in the field. Because the distance between arrogance and catastrophe is measured not in miles, but in silence. Irony and reversal, the cost of victory. Victory in the Pacific came with its own irony. By 1945, the United States had mastered the art of killing efficiently. Its torpedoes, bombs, and firestorms reduced Japan to ruins. But in that mastery lay a new danger. The same blindness that once plagued the Bureau began to creep back, hidden beneath triumph. Lockwood saw it. He warned in a 1946 speech, "We must never again trust the infallibility of machines. They are only as good as the men who doubt them." His words were prophetic. Within a decade, the world entered the nuclear age, another era of perfect weapons untested in the realities they promised to control. The Mark 14's lesson was already being forgotten. The universal message. If history has one rhythm, it is this. Technology advances, arrogance follows, humility returns through failure. The torpedo story is not about submarines or explosives. It is about civilization itself. It shows how progress, unchecked by skepticism, becomes its own trap. Every age produces its mad admirals, men or women who question sacred truths. Most are ignored. Some are punished. A few change the course of nations. Charles Lockwood's courage reminds us that truth does not always wear a uniform. It sometimes stands alone, armed only with conviction and data sheets, whispering against the roar of institutions. Something is wrong. The deep hum of the ocean floor. The camera drifts through blue darkness, past wrecks of submarines long silent. A corroded torpedo lies half buried in sand, its nose dented, its propellers still. Light filters down through the water, cold, beautiful, eternal. War does not only reveal what we can destroy. It reveals what we refuse to see. The torpedo that would not explode became the mirror of a nation, brilliant, confident, and for a time blind. The image fades to the horizon, sunlight rippling across calm seas. In the end, Admiral Lockwood's battle was not for steel but for truth. And truth, like the sea, cannot be buried. It waits, deep, patient, and merciless, for those brave enough to die for it. The real legacy of Charles Lockwood is not a working torpedo. It is the rediscovery of conscience within power, the understanding that progress without accountability is merely illusion in motion. Every commander, every scientist, every citizen who faces failure must eventually ask the same question Lockwood asked in 1942. Are we brave enough to test what we believe? For it is not the explosion that changes history. It is the inquiry. A solemn orchestral rise, mingled with the soft rhythm of waves.